I didn't think the worst moment of my adult life would start with a polite smile and a clipboard, but that's how it happened. I was standing outside a renovated vineyard venue just outside town, watching guests step out of black sedans and laugh like they were walking into a movie scene. Linen suits, summer dresses, champagne flutes already sweating in the heat. And then my older brother leaned slightly toward me, lowered his voice just enough to sound reasonable, and said, "You weren't invited. This is more of a family thing." I remember nodding like I understood, apologizing for the confusion like I was the one who'd made a mistake, and turning around while a few people nearby pretended not to stare. What none of them knew was that I was the reason the lights were on inside at all. I'm Ethan. I'm 34. I've spent most of my life being the quiet one in my family, the reliable one, the one who handled things without making a big deal out of it. If you asked my parents, they'd say I was independent in the way people say when they mean you don't need much from them. If you asked my brother, he'd probably say I was fine on my own, which was his way of explaining why he always seemed to get more of everything. More attention, more forgiveness, more chances. Growing up, my brother Mark was the sun and the rest of us were just planets expected to orbit without complaint. He was older by 5 years, louder by nature, and always just a little bit more visible. If he got in trouble, it was because he was passionate. If I did something wrong, it was because I should have known better. That dynamic followed us into adulthood in ways I didn't fully recognize until much later. Family dinners where his opinions filled the room while mine were nodded at and forgotten. Holidays where his schedule determined the plan. Small comments that added up over time, like paper cuts you don't notice until you're bleeding. I moved out early, partly for work and partly because it was easier to breathe when I wasn't constantly being compared. I built a life that looked quiet from the outside, but took a lot of effort behind the scenes. I worked in finance, not flashy, not glamorous, but stable. I learned how systems worked, how risk was measured, how problems were smoothed over quietly so no one else had to panic. That last part would end up maturing more than I ever expected. Mark, on the other hand, liked big moves, big ideas, big announcements. He bounced between ventures the way some people bounce between hobbies. A restaurant concept here, an event company there. Always something that sounded impressive at family gatherings, and always something that needed just a little help when the numbers didn't quite add up. My parents never said no to him. They couldn't. He had a way of making his urgency feel like everyone else's responsibility. When Mark announced he was getting married, the news came in the form of a group message. A photo of a ring, a caption about forever, and about 20 exclamation points. I congratulated him like everyone else. I meant it. His fiancée, Claire, was polite to me in the careful way people are when they don't really know what to do with you. She was always friendly, always a bit distant, like she'd already decided where I fit in the family hierarchy. Somewhere off to the side. The wedding planning escalated fast. Bigger venue than initially planned. Live band instead of a DJ. Imported flowers that apparently matched the vibe. Each upgrade came with a story about how it would all work out, how sponsorships were coming through, how a partner was about to sign, how it would be fine. I heard most of this secondhand through my parents, who would casually mention the stress in their voices and then quickly change the subject when I asked if everything was actually okay. One evening, my father called me later than usual. He didn't start with small talk. He never did when he was worried. He talked about Mark's determination, about how important this wedding was, about how sometimes banks didn't understand vision. Then he paused, the way people do when they're about to ask for something they know they shouldn't. He asked if I'd be willing to look over some numbers for Mark, just as a second set of eyes. No obligation. I said yes, not because I felt pressured, but because I'd been trained my whole life to step in quietly when things started to wobble. What I saw when I reviewed the documents was worse than I expected. The venue deposit was partially paid. Vendor contracts were contingent. The loan approval was conditional on revenue that didn't exist yet. It was the kind of structure that only held together as long as no one looked too closely. I asked Mark about it over coffee a few days later. He waved it off, laughed, told me I worried too much. Said things always came together for him. They usually do, he said, smiling like that settled it. I should have walked away then. I know that now. But family is complicated, and years of being the dependable one don't just disappear because you finally notice the imbalance. I didn't want my parents panicking. I didn't want Claire embarrassed. I didn't want Mark's wedding to collapse under the weight of his own optimism. So I did something I didn't tell anyone about. I called in a favor, then another. I reviewed the loan terms line by line and quietly added my name where it would stabilize the whole thing. Not as a co-borrower in the obvious sense, as a guarantor, the kind of signature that sits in the background and only becomes visible when things go wrong. The banker explained the risk. I understood it. I accepted it anyway. I told myself it was temporary, that once the wedding was over, once the dust settled, Mark would refinance or pay it down or at least acknowledge what I'd done. I didn't need applause. I just wanted the situation handled. The months leading up to the wedding were a blur of planning updates I wasn't included in and decisions I found out about after the fact. Seating charts discussed without me. Family meetings where I somehow wasn't available. When invitations went out, I assumed mine had gotten lost. It wouldn't have been the first time. I waited. I didn't push. I told myself it would sort itself out. It didn't. A week before the wedding, my mother called and casually asked what suit I was wearing. I told her I hadn't received an invitation. There was a pause on the line, the kind that carries too much meaning for how short it is. She said Mark had handled the guest list, that it must have been an oversight, that she'd talked to him. She never called back. So there I was, on the day of the wedding, standing outside a venue I had effectively kept afloat, being told by my own brother that I didn't belong inside. I remember the way he avoided my eyes, the way he framed it like a logistical issue instead of a personal one. I remember thinking, with a strange sense of calm, that this wasn't actually about space or numbers or confusion. It was about hierarchy, about who was considered essential and who was optional. I walked away before I said something I couldn't take back. I got in my car and sat there longer than I meant to, hands on the steering wheel, listening to laughter drift through the open windows of the venue. I didn't feel angry right away. I felt hollow, like something I'd been carrying for years had finally been set down, not gently, but because I didn't have the strength to hold it anymore. That night, as the sun set and the reception went into full swing without me, my phone buzzed with a notification from my bank. Just a routine alert. Nothing urgent. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, already aware that the quiet role I'd played up until now was about to become impossible to maintain. I didn't open the bank notification that night. I told myself it could wait. I told myself I'd already had enough emotion for one day. Instead, I drove home, ordered takeout I'd barely touched, and sat on my couch watching the hours crawl by while the wedding I wasn't invited to unfolded across town. Social media made it impossible to ignore. Photos of the ceremony, the vineyard glowing under string lights, my parents smiling like this was the happiest day of their lives. Mark and Claire kissing, champagne spraying, captions about perfect families and unforgettable nights. I felt like I was watching a version of my life where I'd been quietly edited out. The next morning, my mother called as if nothing unusual had happened. Her tone was light, almost cheerful, the way it always was when she wanted to smooth something over without actually addressing it. She said the wedding was beautiful. She said she wished I could have been there, but things had gotten complicated. She didn't explain what complicated meant, and I didn't ask. I told her I was glad it went well and ended the call before my voice could betray how tight my chest felt. For a few days after that, things were oddly quiet. No one reached out to apologize. No one acknowledged what had happened at the venue entrance. Mark didn't text. Claire didn't send a message. It was as if my absence had been neatly folded into the narrative, inconvenient, but manageable. I went back to work, threw myself into projects, and told myself that distance might finally be the thing that recalibrated our family dynamic. Maybe this was the moment I stopped overfunctioning and let other people deal with the consequences of their own choices. Then the request started. It began with my father calling to ask if I could review a document. Just a quick look, he said. Mark had sent it over and wanted another opinion. I told him, calmly, that I didn't think it was appropriate for me to be involved anymore. There was a long silence on the line. Then my father sighed, the sound heavy with disappointment, and said, I thought you'd want to help. You're good at this sort of thing. The implication hung there, unspoken but familiar. I was useful when something needed fixing, optional when it didn't. A few days later, my mother asked if I could come by for dinner. She said she missed me. I almost declined, but part of me still hoped there was a conversation coming, a real one, where someone would finally say, that shouldn't have happened to you. I showed up with a bottle of wine and a cautious optimism I should have known better than to indulge. Dinner was awkward from the start. Mark wasn't there, which my mother explained away by saying he and Claire were exhausted from the wedding and honeymoon planning. The food tasted fine, but every bite felt heavy. Halfway through the meal, my parents exchanged a look I recognized immediately. The look that meant something was about to be asked. My mother started by talking about how expensive weddings had become, how young couples today were under so much pressure to make everything perfect. My father nodded along, adding comments about unexpected costs and timing issues with payments. I listened quietly, my fork resting on the edge of my plate. I already knew where this was going. Then my mother said, "Mark mentioned that the bank has been asking questions. Just routine things." She smiled, as if that should reassure me. "He said you'd probably understand all that better than we do." I set my fork down completely. I asked what kind of questions the bank was asking. She waved her hand dismissively and said it was nothing serious, just paperwork. But my father avoided my eyes, and that told me everything. I asked, directly, if there was an issue with the loan. That was when my mother's tone shifted. She stopped trying to sound casual and leaned into something firmer, more defensive. She said families help each other. She said Mark had a lot on his plate. She said I'd always been the steady one, and that this was just another moment where I could step up. The word step up hit me harder than I expected, as if I hadn't been standing in the background holding everything together for years. I reminded them, carefully, that I hadn't even been invited to the wedding. The room went quiet. My mother frowned and said that had been Mark's decision. My father added that weddings were stressful and that feelings sometimes got hurt unintentionally. He said we shouldn't dwell on the past when there were more important things to focus on. That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a clean, sharp break. I realized they weren't going to acknowledge what had happened unless it became inconvenient not to. My hurt was abstract to them. The loan, however, was very real. I told them I needed transparency. I asked to see the loan documents. I asked exactly what my involvement was. My mother looked startled, as if the idea that I might want to understand my own risk hadn't occurred to her. My father hesitated, then admitted that Mark had listed me as a guarantor with the bank. He said it like it was a technicality, like it didn't fundamentally change anything. I stood up from the table. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. I told them I had agreed to guarantee the loan temporarily, under the assumption that I was supporting a family event I was part of. I told them I had never agreed to be a silent backstop for people who couldn't even extend me the courtesy of an invitation. My mother accused me of making things transactional. My father said I was overreacting. I left before dessert. That night, I finally opened the bank notification. It wasn't urgent, exactly, but it wasn't nothing either. It was a notice about a delayed payment from the primary borrower. A reminder of my contingent responsibility. Clinical language, no emotion, just facts. Over the next few weeks, the situation deteriorated quickly. Mark stopped returning my calls entirely. When I tried to talk to him directly, he texted back hours later with vague reassurances. Everything was under control. I worried too much. I was being dramatic. Claire posted photos from their honeymoon, captions about new beginnings and gratitude. My parents urged patience. They told me not to stress Mark out while he was adjusting to married life. Then came the meeting. My father called and said the family needed to sit down together. All of us. He said there were misunderstandings that needed to be cleared up. He said Mark felt hurt and confused by my distance. That phrasing alone made my stomach drop. Hurt and confused. As if this had all happened to him. We met at my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon. Mark and Claire arrived late, still dressed like people who'd just come from brunch somewhere nicer. Mark barely looked at me when he walked in. Claire gave me a tight smile and took a seat beside him, their shoulders touching like a united front. The conversation started politely and unraveled fast. Mark accused me of pulling away when he needed support. He said I'd embarrassed him by making a fuss about the invitation. He said the wedding guest list had been limited and that not everything was about me. My mother nodded along. My father tried to mediate but kept framing the issue as a mutual misunderstanding. Then Mark said something that made the room feel suddenly very small. He said, "Look, the loan was always a family thing. You were never really on the hook. Mom and Dad said you'd understand." I asked him what he meant by that. He shrugged and said that since I wasn't married and didn't have kids, it made sense for me to help out more. That I had fewer responsibilities. That it wasn't fair for him and Claire to carry all the risk when they were just starting their life together. Claire finally spoke then. She said she assumed I was fine with it. She said Mark had told her I'd offered. She said it casually, like it was a settled fact. I looked at my parents. My mother avoided my eyes. My father rubbed his temples and said maybe things had gotten mixed up, but that at the end of the day, family sacrifices for family. That was the moment I understood the betrayal wasn't just about the wedding. It wasn't even just about the money. It was about how easily they decided my consent was optional, how comfortable they were rewriting my role to suit their needs, how little my dignity factored into any of it. I asked one final question. I asked if Mark had ever intended to tell me when he missed the first payment, or if he'd just planned to let the bank notify me when things went bad. Mark didn't answer. He didn't have to. I left the house without saying goodbye. As I drove away, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the bank, this one marked important. I didn't pull over. I already knew that whatever I was about to read would change the nature of my relationship with my family permanently. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it. I didn't read the message from the bank until I got home. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. Engine off, phone resting in my hand like it weighed more than it should. When I finally opened it, the language was still calm and professional, but the meaning was unmistakable. The missed payment had triggered a review. If it wasn't resolved within a specific window, the guarantor would be contacted directly to discuss next steps. I was the guarantor, the quiet safety net, the invisible solution everyone assumed would hold. I went inside and closed the door behind me without turning on the lights. I remember sitting on the floor with my back against the couch, shoes still on, staring at nothing while the reality of my situation settled in. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was exposed. Financially, legally, emotionally. I'd stepped in to protect a family moment and had somehow become the only person actually at risk. The next few weeks were some of the loneliest of my life. Mark didn't call. When I tried, it went straight to voicemail. My parents sent texts that carefully avoided specifics. Messages about keeping the peace, about not letting money come between family, about how stressful this was for everyone. I noticed how often they used words like everyone and family when what they really meant was Mark. I stopped replying after a while, not out of spite, but because every exchange left me feeling smaller. The bank, on the other hand, was very clear. They laid out the timeline. They explained the contingencies. They reminded me, politely, of the obligation I'd accepted. I couldn't even be angry at them. They were just doing their jobs. I was the one who'd believed good intentions would be enough protection. Sleep became difficult. I'd lie awake replaying conversations, looking for the moment I should have said no. I ran numbers in my head, calculating worst-case scenarios. I told myself I could cover it if I had to, but that knowledge didn't bring comfort. It brought resentment. The idea that my stability was being treated like a communal resource, something others could dip into without permission, made my chest ache in a way I hadn't felt before. Eventually, the stress caught up with me at work. I missed a deadline. Then another. My manager pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay. I almost laughed at how gentle he sounded compared to the chaos in my head. I told him I was dealing with some personal matters. He nodded, understanding, but I could tell his patience wasn't infinite. For the first time in years, I felt the ground under my carefully built life start to shift. Rock bottom isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's realizing you've spent so long being dependable that you don't actually know who you are without that role. I wasn't angry all the time anymore. I was tired. I stopped answering calls. I ate poorly. I let dishes pile up in the sink. The version of me who always had things under control felt very far away. The turning point didn't come in a moment of triumph. It came on a random Tuesday evening when I opened my laptop to distract myself and ended up reviewing the loan documents again. Not because I had to, but because I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I read every clause slowly, this time without the assumption that everything would magically work out. I noticed things I'd glossed over before. Conditions, options, leverage I hadn't realized I had. For the first time since the wedding, I felt something shift. Not hope, exactly, but clarity. I started making calls. Not emotional ones. Practical ones. I spoke to an attorney recommended by a colleague, framed the situation in neutral terms, and asked what my rights were. I met with a financial advisor who didn't know my family and therefore had no reason to minimize what was happening. I gathered information the way I always had, methodically, quietly, without announcing it to anyone. I didn't tell my parents what I was doing. I didn't warn Mark. I didn't confront Claire. I focused on myself in a way I never had before. There was something strangely empowering about keeping my plans private, about not offering reassurance or solutions to people who hadn't earned them. At the same time, I began rebuilding parts of my life that had nothing to do with my family. I started going to the gym again, not obsessively, just consistently. I cooked real meals. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected over the years because I'd been too busy being available for everyone else. When I told them, vaguely, that I was dealing with family issues, they didn't ask me to fix anything. They just listened. I hadn't realized how rare that was. Work improved too. Once I stopped carrying the emotional weight of constant obligation, my focus sharpened. I took on a new project, then another. I remembered that I was competent, respected, capable. That my value didn't come from cleaning up other people's messes. It came from the skills I'd earned and the discipline I'd built over time. The bank situation stabilized temporarily. Mark managed to make a partial payment after my parents stepped in. It wasn't enough to resolve everything, but it bought time. Time I used wisely. I structured my finances more defensively. I documented everything. I prepared for scenarios I hoped wouldn't happen, but refused to be blindsided by again. What surprised me most during that period wasn't my family's continued avoidance. It was how easily they adjusted to my absence. Holidays passed with group photos posted online, captions about togetherness and gratitude. I wasn't in them. No one mentioned it. It hurt, but it also clarified something I'd been avoiding for years. I had been present in their lives because I was useful, not because I was valued in the way I'd always assumed family meant. Mark eventually reached out, but not with an apology. He wanted reassurance. He wanted to know if everything was handled. The wording made my jaw tighten. I told him I was managing my responsibilities. I didn't elaborate. He didn't ask how I was. He thanked me and ended the call. That conversation lingered with me longer than it should have. Not because of what he said, but because of how little it affected me. The old version of me would have felt obligated to soothe him, to promise things would be okay. This time, I felt detached, observant, like I was finally seeing the dynamic clearly instead of living inside it. As the months passed, my life began to look steadier from the outside. From the inside, I was still recalibrating. I was learning how to say no without explanation, how to prioritize my own well-being without guilt, how to sit with discomfort instead of immediately trying to resolve it for someone else's benefit. And yet, beneath that growing sense of stability, there was something unresolved. The loan was still there. The truth about what I'd done to save that wedding was still known only to me and a handful of professionals. My family still believed the story they'd told themselves, where I was a background character whose purpose was to smooth things over quietly. They didn't know that the quiet period wasn't surrender. It was preparation. One evening, as I reviewed an updated statement from the bank, I noticed a new detail. A change in status. A development that hadn't existed before. I leaned back in my chair and read it again, slower this time, the implications unfolding in my mind one by one. The path forward was becoming clearer, and it was very different from what my family expected. I closed my laptop and sat there in the dim light of my apartment, feeling something I hadn't felt since before the wedding. Control. I didn't act on that new information right away. I let it sit. I learned, over the years, that the most dangerous decisions aren't made in anger, but in haste. What I felt that night wasn't rage anyway. It was something colder, more deliberate. The kind of calm that only comes when you finally understand the board you're playing on. The update from the bank wasn't dramatic on the surface. No threats, no urgent language. Just a change in classification tied to the loan structure and the guarantor agreement. A clause I'd paid attention to before, but not like this. Circumstances had shifted. Payments had been inconsistent enough to trigger options that hadn't been available at the beginning. Options that didn't require emotional appeals or family discussions. Options governed by contracts, not guilt. I didn't tell anyone about it. Instead, I started asking questions. Quiet ones. I scheduled a follow-up meeting with the attorney, this time bringing everything. Emails, text messages, the original paperwork, notes from conversations I documented after the fact. I laid it all out on the table, not as a sob story, but as a timeline. He listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification, occasionally nodding like he'd already anticipated the next development. When I finished, he leaned back and said something that stayed with me. He said, "You've been operating like someone who thinks this is a family problem. It's not. It's a liability problem. And right now, you're the only one treating it seriously. That sentence reframed everything. From that point on, I stopped thinking in terms of confrontation. I thought in terms of positioning. What did I control? What did I know that others didn't? What assumptions were my family still making that worked in my favor? They assumed I'd absorb the risk quietly, the way I always had. They assumed I'd warn them if something was about to go wrong. They assumed that my silence meant compliance. I let them keep those assumptions. I continued responding to my parents' messages politely but vaguely. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. When my mother asked how things were going with the bank stuff, I said it was being handled. When my father suggested we all sit down again and talk it through, I said I didn't think another emotional conversation would help. That phrasing mattered. It made me sound reasonable, even conciliatory. It also shut the door on discussions they could manipulate. Mark reached out more frequently as time went on, though never directly about money. He talked around it instead, asked how work was, mentioned stress, dropped hints about how expensive married life was. Each conversation was a test, whether he realized it or not. He was probing for reassurance. I gave him none. Behind the scenes, I kept building. I met with the bank again, this time not as a worried guarantor, but as an informed party asking very specific questions. I didn't threaten. I didn't posture. I asked about processes, about thresholds, about what happened when certain conditions weren't met. I asked who would be notified and when. The banker answered carefully, but answers were answers. I also learned things I hadn't expected to learn. About how the venue had structured their contracts. About which payments were tied to which events. About what guarantees actually meant in practice, not just in theory. The more I understood, the more obvious it became how reckless Mark had been. How much of the wedding's success had depended on optimism instead of planning. How close the whole thing had come to collapsing even before I stepped in. That realization didn't make me feel proud. It made me feel resolved. I wasn't doing this to teach a lesson. I wasn't interested in humiliation. I wanted alignment between responsibility and consequence. For once, I wanted the people who made the decisions to feel the weight of them. I also wasn't alone anymore. One of the unexpected side effects of focusing on my own life again was that people began to see me differently. At work, a senior colleague I respected pulled me aside and asked if I'd be interested in collaborating on a side venture he was exploring. Nothing risky, nothing flashy, just an opportunity that required trust and competence. He said he liked how I handled pressure, how I didn't overpromise. I said yes. That project didn't solve my family problem, but it did something just as important. It reminded me that my skills had value outside of my last name, that I could choose where to invest my energy, that the version of me my family relied on wasn't the only version that existed. As my confidence returned, so did my patience. I stopped feeling the urge to rush toward an outcome. I could wait. I had time. The clock wasn't actually working against me anymore. It was working against them. The real shift happened when my mother called one evening, her voice tight with concern. She said Mark and Claire were under a lot of stress. She said there were rumors the bank was being difficult. She asked, carefully, if I knew anything about that. I told her the truth without revealing anything useful. I said banks tend to get less flexible when patterns emerge. I said consistency mattered. I said I trusted Mark to handle his responsibilities. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "You're being very distant lately." I said, "I'm being careful." That was the first time I heard fear in her voice. Not fear for me. Fear of losing control of a narrative she'd been comfortable with for years. The narrative where Mark was the golden child, where problems were smoothed over, where I quietly absorbed whatever imbalance existed so the family could maintain its image. After that call, things accelerated. Mark called late one night, his tone strained, his confidence finally cracked. He said the bank had contacted him directly. He said there were questions. He asked if I'd heard anything. I told him I was aware of general developments. He asked what that meant. I said it meant contracts were being enforced. He got defensive. He said this was supposed to be temporary. He said family didn't do this to each other. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said something I'd practiced in my head many times. I said, "I didn't do anything to you. I stopped protecting you." The line went quiet. He accused me of being vindictive. I told him I was being accurate. He said I was putting his marriage at risk. I told him I hadn't been invited to celebrate it. He hung up on me. That was fine. I didn't need him to understand yet. A few days later, I received an email confirming something I'd been anticipating. A formal notice. Procedural, neutral in tone, but significant. It outlined the next phase if conditions weren't met within a defined time frame. It also outlined who would be contacted and what actions would follow. I read it twice, then forwarded it to my attorney. He replied with a single sentence. If you're ready, this is where the leverage becomes visible. I wasn't sure yet how my family would react when the invisible scaffolding holding everything up was finally exposed. I didn't know who would panic first or who would try to rewrite history. I only knew that the moment they dismissed me at the venue entrance, they'd assumed I'd walk away quietly and disappear. They were right about one thing. I had walked away. The final notice didn't arrive with drama. No raised voices. No slammed doors. Just an email with attachments and deadlines that didn't care about family dynamics. That was the thing my parents and Mark never seemed to understand. Systems don't bend for sentiment. They respond to inputs. And for months the inputs had been sloppy, delayed, hopeful instead of concrete. The window the bank had extended quietly, the one my partial guarantees and temporary fixes had kept open, closed with the kind of certainty that doesn't ask permission. I didn't rush to tell anyone. I let the notices go where they were designed to go. Mark received his first. The venue received theirs shortly after. Vendors followed. It wasn't punitive. It was procedural. When obligations aren't met, contingencies activate. When contingencies activate, responsibilities surface. Mine had been invisible for a long time by design. Now the spotlight shifted. Mark called me the next morning, his voice frantic in a way I'd never heard before. He asked what was happening. He said the bank was talking about restructuring, about collateral, about accelerating timelines. He said the venue manager had called him directly, confused and upset. He asked me what I'd done. I told him the truth, calmly and without heat. I told him I'd stepped back from shielding him. I told him I'd allowed the agreements to operate as written. I told him that everything unfolding now was a direct result of choices he'd made while assuming someone else would catch him if he fell. He accused me of setting him up. I reminded him that I hadn't written the contracts. He said I could fix this. I reminded him that I already had, once, and that it had cost me more than he'd ever acknowledged. He asked me what I wanted. That question sat between us for a moment, heavier than anything else he'd said. I didn't want an apology anymore. I didn't want gratitude. I wanted alignment. Accountability. I wanted the truth to be visible to the people who'd spent years pretending not to see it. I told him what I wanted was for my name to be removed from the guarantor agreement immediately, replaced by actual collateral or actual repayment. I told him I wanted a written acknowledgement of my involvement and the role I'd played in keeping the wedding afloat. Not for public display. For record. I told him that if those conditions weren't met, I would proceed exactly as I was, without intervention. He said I was tearing the family apart. I said the family had already decided who was expendable. I just stopped volunteering. The next call came from my parents. Both of them on the line, voices overlapping, trying to sound calm and failing. They asked how I could let things get this far. I asked them how far they thought things were when they let Mark list me as a guarantor without my informed consent and then excluded me from the event I'd protected. There was silence. Then my mother cried. My father said we could figure something out together. I told them together would have required honesty months ago. They tried to negotiate emotionally. They talked about forgiveness, about how families move past mistakes, about how Mark was under pressure. I listened, and for the first time, I didn't absorb any of it. I responded with facts, dates, documents, statements. I told them exactly what I'd done, exactly when I'd done it, and exactly what would happen if the situation wasn't resolved properly. I told them that I would no longer be the invisible solution. The fallout was immediate and messy. Mark and Claire had to liquidate assets they'd assumed were untouchable. The honeymoon extensions were canceled. The apartment they'd been planning to upgrade became a necessity instead of a stepping stone. My parents dipped into savings they'd always insisted were off limits, suddenly finding flexibility when the alternative became public scrutiny and financial consequences. The venue didn't close, but it didn't forget either. The bank restructured on stricter terms. My name came off the guarantor agreement, replaced by realities Mark could no longer dodge. The acknowledgement I'd requested arrived via email a week later, written stiffly and without warmth, but accurate. It documented my involvement in black and white. That mattered more than tone. Socially, the family fractured in predictable ways. Some relatives whispered. Some avoided me entirely. Others reached out privately, admitting they'd always suspected things weren't as balanced as they appeared. Mark didn't speak to me for months. Claire blocked me on social media. My parents oscillated between resentment and forced politeness, unsure how to interact with me now that I wasn't playing my old role. And me? I slept better than I had in a year. There was grief in the aftermath, but it wasn't the kind that destroys you. It was the kind that clears space. I mourned the version of family I believed in, the one where effort was reciprocated and loyalty was mutual. Once that illusion was gone, I was free to build something more honest in its place. Work continued to improve. The side venture turned into a serious opportunity. My confidence grew, not from revenge, but from self-respect. I didn't brag. I didn't post cryptic messages. I didn't need an audience. The satisfaction came from knowing that for once, the outcome matched the truth of the situation. Months later, I ran into Mark by chance at a grocery store. He looked older, tired. We exchanged stiff pleasantries. He didn't apologize. I didn't expect him to. As we parted, he said, quietly, that he hadn't known how much I'd done. I told him knowing wasn't the same as acknowledging, and left it at that. My parents and I speak occasionally now, carefully, with boundaries that didn't exist before. They don't ask me to fix things anymore. I don't offer. Sometimes I think back to that moment at the venue entrance, the way I nodded and apologized for a confusion that wasn't mine. I remember the feeling of walking away while people watched, assuming I was the one being excluded from something important. They were wrong. I wasn't walking away from a celebration. I was walking away from a role that no longer fit, taking with me the leverage, the clarity, and the quiet certainty that I would never again keep someone else's world standing at the expense of my own.